So I think both Matt Zeitlin and Josh Fried, who will be on stage in a moment, expressed some bemusement that they had been drafted into the implementation wars, which is maybe a dramatic name for this conversation, but it reflects, I think, our view at Breakthrough that as challenging as the passage of IRA and EJA and CHIPS and all of it were, in many ways we think the difficult work is still ahead of us. And so we wanted to have a conversation about that, and we wanted to sort of start this event with a real sort of nuts and bolts conversation about the sort of difficult challenges and trade-offs that we still face looking ahead at the policy horizon. So I'm very excited for this this first panel of Ecomodernism 2023 to sort of set that context for us. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Matt, Catherine, Josh, and Rob.
Welcome, everyone, and thanks for being here this morning. I think the way this is going to work is that we're going to hear from Catherine first, and then Rob, and then Josh. Catherine will talk about some of her work on trade, and Rob will be giving some of his kind of critiques of how industrial policy has worked under the Biden administration, and then Josh will be giving I think we discussed a qualified defense of how that works, and we'll take it from there. All right, Catherine.
You want me to stand up?
You don't have to.
Okay. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's really fun to be here. I wanted to start with some personal reflections on the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA. When it passed in the summer of 22, I was working in the Biden administration, working at Treasury, and in fact, running around trying to convince people that the price cap on Russian oil was real, and we wanted them to buy cheap oil. So literally the day that the Manchin-Schumer deal was announced, I was in Brussels talking to some of our counterparts there. And we came in the morning after the news came out, and there was an audible sigh of relief from our counterparts. They had weathered the previous administration, they'd been whipsawed by that, and so they were just delighted that the US was back at the table. So I think it's worth considering what the world would have looked like if IRA hadn't passed. I mean, we would have gamely gone out and tried to enact regulations, but it would have been hard to justify, hard to argue that the US was on track to meet its Paris commitments with only regulation, and hard to answer questions about how robust those regulatory changes were to changes in future administrations. And I think therefore hard to kind of back up the Paris Agreement. If the US can't meet its side of the commitment, what is this agreement? So I think that's important because, as our European counterparts pointed out and asked us through questions, IRA is pretty resilient. The way it was designed is really pretty brilliant, and a lot of the investments are already showing up in red states and red congressional districts. And so, the resiliency of IRA is a lot better than the resiliency of the regulatory actions that we would have been forced to take. So I think the initial enthusiasm from our European and other counterparts about IRA waned as they read the fine print of IRA. There were a couple things that they were worried about. The thing that got the most attention were the domestic content provisions. So things like the electric vehicle and battery subsidies that only apply to batteries manufactured in North America. So those have kind of partially been addressed by Treasury guidance that came out and suggested that electric vehicles that were leased didn't have to meet those requirements. So we haven't heard quite as much about that. I think the bigger issue, and the one that I suspect we'll hear more about in the future, and maybe not just from the Europeans, but also from the Canadians, is that we are taking a fundamentally different approach to mitigating climate than the rest of the G7 is. So the rest of the G7, the Europeans, the UK, the Canadians, the Japanese, they're all pricing carbon. And in fact, if you look at the whole OECD, take out the US, over half of the emissions in the OECD are subject to a carbon price. So basically, they're pricing the dirty stuff, we're subsidizing the clean stuff. Both strategies have economic appeal, but when you kind of combine them, you are led with, there are some trade difficulties. So for instance, the Boston Consulting Group did an analysis of manufacturing green steel, not looking at Boston Metal green steel, but they projected that in 2030, it would be 43% cheaper to produce green steel in the US, given the subsidies for carbon capture and sequestration, than it would be to produce green steel in Germany. And so if you're a German industry player or a German politician, you're going to be worried. You're going to see some kind of competitiveness effects. Companies will move from Germany to the US. We're already seeing some of the announcements of new plants opening in the US. They were going to open in the EU, but decided to open in the US instead, where they're subsidized for doing something rather than taxed if they don't do something, or taxed for their emissions. So I think, this kind of fundamental difference of approach, I worry about the repercussions of this. So here's one kind of negative outcome, that the German politicians, the EU politicians in general, get pressure from industry. They think about abandoning the carbon price, about abandoning the European emissions trading system. That's terrible for the climate. The emissions trading system has been very effective. The EU has seen the greatest reduction in emissions of anywhere in the world. And so if they remove the ETS, they might think about replacing it with subsidies. Maybe Germany and France, the big countries can use subsidies. The Slovakias of the world, they might find it a lot harder to pay for subsidies. And so without the carbon price, they'll be left with much less to do on reducing climate emissions. So I think there's this potential for kind of negative feedback effects from the fact that we're taking a different approach from the EU and from, frankly, as I said, the rest of the G7. So what do we do about this? I think there are a couple things. One is to really focus on a big topic of conversation here today, which is the technology development and the technology deployment. IRA included a lot of subsidies for new technologies. There's the potential to really move some of these technologies down the learning curve. Things like direct air capture, carbon capture and sequestration, hydrogen, clean hydrogen. Maybe we'll see some of the green hydrogen. And so we need to be thinking about how not just to make the US a leader in this, but how to diffuse those technologies to the rest of the world. So that's one thing I think we can do. The other thing is really pay attention to the sectors where we're taking a much more similar approach to what the Europeans and the rest of the developed world is doing. So things like methane emissions from the oil and gas sector. I have a policy brief out pointing to the fact that the Inflation Reduction Act actually has a price on greenhouse gas emissions. It's the price on methane emissions from oil and gas, and proposing that the US and the EU kind of work together on that and build a coalition of energy importers. I think the third thing we should do, and I've saved the best for last, is think about carbon pricing in the US. I know that on Twitter, I know that the kind of chattering class is using IRA as a way to dance on carbon pricing's grave, but I think there are a couple things to keep in mind. For one thing, the world has changed and we passed IRA. So I think carbon pricing in the presence of IRA looks a lot different. IRA is going to encourage a lot of employers, or a lot of labor, a lot of customers in the US to see that the clean energy revolution is here, that they can be part of it. And so I think carbon pricing becomes a lot less threatening in that context. IRA is also driving down the prices for energy. So the little boost in prices for energy that you get from carbon pricing is not enough, depending on the level of the carbon price, is not enough to actually raise energy prices. I think a second thing is that the world has changed. It's changed with the introduction of IRA. It's also, someone last night said the world is different than it was in 2011. It's also very different than it was in 2010, the last time we talked about carbon pricing. And it's a whole lot different than it was in 1993 when we talked about the BTU tax. So I think we need to be aware of those things. I think the third thing, and again, I've saved the best for last, is that with carbon pricing, we have the ability to raise revenue. So think about 2025. And that year, the Trump tax cuts expire. There is bipartisan appeal to extending those Trump tax cuts, but that will cost $4 trillion over the budget window. And so, you hope that Congress will not just continue raising the deficits. We've experiencing a lot of costs from raising deficits. There was the higher interest rates, the downgrade. And so if you have a carbon price, depending again on the level that you set it, we estimate that you can contribute about $1 trillion to that deficit. So I think this is something that hopefully will become appealing to Congress in 2025. And so if the US is able to show leadership on this and is able to join and pass a carbon price, I think we have the possibility of having a really positive dynamic here rather than the negative dynamic that I described before. And the EU is already kind of going down that positive dynamic road with the introduction of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So the carbon border adjustment mechanism introduced yesterday, October 1st, inspires other countries to adopt carbon pricing. The way it works is that if you are exporting into the EU and you don't have a carbon price, then your industry pays the carbon price at the border. It's as though they're facing the carbon price. And so a bunch of countries, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, India to a certain extent, are thinking now, okay, if I put on a carbon price, I get to keep that revenue. My industry is already facing the price when they export to the EU, but now it's just kind of a pure revenue decision that I decide to put on the carbon price. And so you can have this really positive dynamic where the bigger the coalition of countries gets that are following this logic that adopt the carbon price, the more interesting it becomes for the rest of the world to go to carbon pricing. I know it's not the only solution, but it would be a tremendous, tremendous step in the right direction to have global or close to global agreement on a carbon price. So just to conclude, the IRA was an impressive piece of legislation. We need to figure out how to build on IRA and how to really win the implementation wars. I think the important war are the differences that we're seeing between the US and the rest of the developed world. Thank you.
Great. Rob?
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay. I can see my slides, that's cool. I can just read them. So, look, I think the reality is everybody's all excited. And so I've been focused on industrial policy basically since I came to Washington in 1989. I was at NIST, and there used to be industrial policy conversation back then because we were competing with the Japanese. Then it went away, and then the neoclassical economists took total dominance in Washington, and they poo-pooed anything with the name industrial policy, and now we're back in this moment, if you will. I actually don't think we're in the moment. I don't think we're slouching towards it. I think we were basically, if you think about what actually passed, the CHIPS Act was not industrial policy in the sense of what people think. It was really a defense bill. It wouldn't have passed if the Defense Department wasn't saying we can't be dependent upon Taiwan. If and when the Chinese invade the island, we're screwed. We're not going to get the chips we need for our weapon systems. If it wasn't for that, there is no way chips would have passed. So that was a defense bill. The IRA was an energy bill. It wasn't an industrial policy bill. It was saying we want to do energy through supporting industry, but that's very different. So we don't have an industrial policy like other countries do that's focused on aerospace, on machine tools, on autos. We just simply don't. And there's two reasons we don't, and that one is because Republicans, a lot of them are bought into this neoclassical nonsense that the market always gets it right. And the Democratic Party has gone so far left that they hate industry now. And their idea of industrial policy is, you could call it green equity. As long as it's green and has equity in it, then it's okay to do. So, and then the second component of this, I think, is imagine somebody getting paid at the end of the week, and they get paid in cash, they go out and get drunk, and they spend every single dollar of it. That was what we did. We're not going to do this again. the only reason we could pass these bills, particularly IRA, is because we were caught up in the fact that we needed some kind of massive stimulus to counter COVID, and the checkbook was open and there were no limits. That's over. It's completely over. The debt now, the deficit this year is double what it was expected to be with the high rising interest rates and having to refinance the federal debt at new interest rates. So I don't have any confidence. And if Republicans take over, we're not going to see much in terms of the IRA. So was the IRA useful? So we did a report, my colleague Robin Gaster and I, but in June, if you haven't seen it, it was called Beyond Force, a realist transition, a realist path to the green transition. And basically what we argued is to solve climate change, you have to do two things. Well, you have to do one thing. You have to get clean technology that's cheap enough and good enough, what we call price performance parity, with dirty technology that the lowest income countries in the world who cannot subsidize it and will not subsidize it and will not put a tax on it, that they would adopt it. And we're a long, long, long way away from there. So when I hear about people talking about how great IRA is, it's basically IRA's great because we're going to build a lot of these factories in the US and hopefully we'll decarbonize a bunch of the US economy. All right, but why is that important? The only reason you would want to do that is if you think that by doing that, you're going to be driving down, let me use it. So these are basically, there's schools of force, the radical optimists, we have all the technology we need. IRA's great because we're just going to produce this technology. The other one here is, it's okay if the US does this, the rest of the world we don't really care about. I think we should care about the rest of the world. At one level, it doesn't really matter what the US does. There's sort of this view in there that, well, we'll do IRA and everybody else in the world will do their own IRA or do their own carbon tax. Yeah, I'm not so sure. And then obviously we need to suffer. By the way, I didn't fly here today. I drove my car from Washington. So this is really, to me, the key factor, and that's where do we think we are in terms of the cost curve on these technologies? So you could argue that hydrogen's up on that red line, probably never get there. Certainly CCS is on that red line. Unless you can figure out some way to make money off of it, CCS is always going to be something you... Now, it's not to say we can't use it in the US and rich countries could do it, but the real question to me is on the IRA projects that are being funded, are they the yellow line or are they the blue line? And to me, there's a lot of evidence to suggest they're on the yellow line. Because a lot of these have already, like lithium batteries. I mean, how many more lithium batteries do we need to make to think that we're going to get down the cost curve? I mean, cost curves don't go like that, they go like that. And if we're already pretty close to where the bottom of the cost curve is on lithium-ion batteries, and many, many other things in there. So the question, I think, and it to me is an empirical question with IRA, is what we're funding in terms of production, is it going to move down the cost curve so that the marginal product that comes out of that is going to be lower than, in an unsubsidized way, ultimately going to lead to a lower cost than dirty fuels? I'm kind of skeptical that that's going to happen. Now, I think this is a recent study by the Energy Information Agency, and it's not IRA, I get that, but it's basically different allocations of renewable energy spending. And what you can see is almost none of it is R&D. Like almost none of it is R&D. And that's not to say that we're not doing some great R&D, ARPA-E, and some other things. We are. But the lion's share of the effort, and IRA just put that on steroids, the lion's share of the effort is not R&D and not innovation. Now, the gentleman from Boston Metal, that's innovation to me. Ultimately, you're going to have to get to production and all that, but it sounded like there was something going on from MIT there that was, so I want to do that sort of thing. I want to see technologies being developed and then help them get out of the lab and into startups or other companies and start scaling them up. But it's not clear that building an LG battery factory in Georgia is going to do this, or even building more electric cars with lithium-ion batteries that, frankly, are adequate, but maybe not fully adequate. It's not clear that lithium-ion batteries are going to get us where we need to be, so why aren't we spending a lot more money on these other things? We hear a lot about this narrative that the Europeans love to tout, that the Americans, we're all a bunch of SUV-driving climate haters, and they're the true climate heroes. And the fact that we don't have a carbon price, which, in my view, we will never have a carbon price, never have a carbon price. And even if we had a carbon price, I remember we wrote a report with Breakthrough years ago, and there was a line in there that said that the microcomputer did not come about from a tax on carbon paper. We didn't shift because the price of typewriters went up. We shifted because of innovation. And I really, we're big supporters of carbon price, don't get me wrong. But carbon prices at the end of the day are a complement. Anyway, we proposed this, I think Breakthrough did 2 years ago. Hey, we should have emission innovation. We should get the big OECD countries to commit to doubling their R&D in 5 years. So we have a new report coming out. My colleague Dave Efros, who's somewhere and leads our clean innovation work, this report should be coming out shortly. But what you can see is they committed to double their R&D in 5 years, and we looked at this over 7 years. And those are mostly the European countries. There are European countries that have cut their R&D, their clean energy R&D over the last 7 years. Now explain to me how they have the right to go up to any meeting and say that they're committed to climate when they cut their clean energy R&D. And when you do it as a share of GDP, you have an even bigger share of countries that have cut their R&D. There's only 3 countries that have met this, and that's the United States, Great Britain, and South Korea. That, to me, is the big solution we should be focusing on. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do IRA or anything like that, but unless we really focus more on innovation, we're not going to get there. And then, and the last point, it goes back to this myth that we have all the technology we need to solve climate. It's just a question of somehow getting it out there. I just don't buy that. I don't think we have anywhere near the technology we need to solve climate, and we're getting so far ahead of ourselves. We're like, well, let's just subsidize the stuff we have rather than develop the stuff we need. So, thank you.
Great.
So I find myself in the somewhat uncomfortable position for me of defending the establishment here. And really interesting comments, and I think this is going to be an interesting conversation when we get to the audience questions and so forth as well. But the decisions that inform not just the Inflation Reduction Act, but also the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS Science Act, and the Energy Act of 2020. And as our friends at ClearPath argue, it should be thought of as a quadfecta that started actually at the tail end of the Trump administration, is that these are all decisions being driven by the science or maybe the art of politics. And it's not the science of economics, it's not the science of climate. And it's informed by the reality that the United States tends to do the right thing after waiting till the absolute last possible moment and considering every other option. And so that's where we are today. And considering the moment that informed both the formulation of the Energy Act of 2020, which was passed by a Republican Senate, a Democratic House, and signed by a Republican president, that laid a lot of the direction for what came, admittedly on steroids, in the Biden administration, is really important. We are in what may be emerging as a post-globalization world. And countries are fracturing into either a sort of democratic-oriented sphere led ostensibly by the United States and other countries, Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and others, or looking at China, Russia, and authoritarian states who are often wielding energy as a way to both entice countries to work with them or as a somewhat soft power force to wield against democracies. We've also just come through the shock of the pandemic and the hard lesson that supply chains, where we rely on other countries, particularly countries that may not have similar values and interests like China and the Chinese government, makes our economy and a lot of other issues much more tenuous. And it's caused a reevaluation of exactly how do we trade and interact with not the entire world, but significant parts of the world. Mass migration and economic anxiety, not just in the United States, but in many countries, including almost all of Europe, have also driven the rise of populism and an increasing number of people in all of these countries that are democracies that are demanding their elected officials and politicians respond to them, that they explain, what is in this for us? How are you reducing costs? How are you creating us opportunities? And if a politician does not successfully answer that to his voters or her constituents, they're no longer in office, and whatever policies they're trying to implement don't become durable. We've seen this in the United States in how domestically working class and non-college educated voters, for the first time really, regardless of race and regardless of ethnicity, are up for grabs. They have looked at what's happened in the policies of both parties, particularly the Republican Party pre-Trump and the Democratic Party for a continuum of years, and said, I don't see myself, I don't see my community in what you're talking about and in the solutions you're offering. And one of the insights that I think we saw, the Energy Act started to get to it, but we saw in the Biden campaign and also in the Biden transition, as they started to think, what are the investments that we need to make and how do we make them, was a recognition that the Recovery Act that was passed under President Obama in 2009 and 2010, in part as a response to the Great Recession and the economic crisis, and also arguably the most successful part of the climate and clean energy agenda that the Obama administration advanced, was that it only got to half the challenge. It helped to stimulate some technologies and technological growth, interestingly, including a small aspirational auto company based in Fresno, California. But what it also did was it sent most of the money to parts of the country that were already succeeding, the technology centers of Austin, of Boston, the area around Washington, D.C., and oftentimes to workers and communities that were already doing well. And instead of helping to address the economic anxiety and concerns and feelings of being left out and ignored that the Great Recession really created in a much greater sense than we'd already seen, in some ways it exacerbated that. And we heard, and I'm sure people in the administration really had this drilled home as well, from the transition on, that any investments that the United States was going to make, any policies, were going to include not just investments in the innovation, investments in technological or economic outcomes, but it was also had to be oriented around people and places. And so that's part of what you saw in how the CHIPS Science Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act were thought of and formed. And I think you have to think about all of those as part of the quadfecta rather than just a standalone bill. As Rob alluded to, the Inflation Reduction Act is particularly thought of as a commercialization and scaling exercise. But it's done within the context of the infrastructure law, which was viewed as much more of a continuation of R&D, stage 2 and 3 research and development and demonstration projects effort had already been passed. And the CHIPS Science Act had also already been passed. And frankly, the fact that they had to pass it because the Defense Department said we need it is just also part of the fine history of the United States, where we have the interstate highway system because the Defense Department said we needed it. We had the internet because ARPA started creating it and said we needed to have a computer network that talked to each other. If that's how we need to get politicians to decide, yes, this is important and we should vote for it, great. That's how democracies work. But it also did stimulate more domestic manufacturing, which is what American voters are asking for and what we're seeing we need more of at a moment when we don't know how our interaction with a lot of other countries is going to plan out over the next 6 years, decade, and beyond. So what we now have is an interaction of several different laws that try to get more innovation in research and development across every technology. These are not renewables only bills. They have investments in everything from advanced nuclear to fusion to all sorts of different aviation to all different types of transportation, clean steel, and on. Hydrogen in all sorts of rainbow colors, which I think we've all lost track of. It recognizes we don't have all the technologies we need. It's part of the reason why a lot of the tax credits are technology neutral, because we don't know what's going to win out. And frankly, that's part of the genius of the bill, and part of why I'm always surprised when you see it characterized, and we see this particularly from Republicans, but also from others, as renewables only, or an assumption that we have all the technology we need. There's an explicit understanding that that is not the case. There are limitations on how much funding is available because there's always limitations in the United States. But it's directed in a different way, and it's designed to layer. So you go through the infrastructure law process, you get funding for inventing and developing and starting to demonstrate a new technology. You can then start commercializing it thanks to the tax credits that Treasury is starting to roll out that include incentives to build it in an traditional energy community. You get incentives to hire the former workers at, say, the coal plant that retired, that employed IBEW union workers. You have more incentives as you scale it, and on. So it's built within all of those considerations, and it's designed to be both politically durable as well as to pull all of the technologies that are, by the way, competing in a market where you have enormous incumbents who are also subsidized, to find out whether new technologies can, as Third Way strongly believes and advocates for, become cheaper than fossil fuels and outcompete them. One last point on carbon pricing. I think Rob and I are in violent agreement that we're not going to see a domestic carbon price in the United States. It's extremely hard, whether the merits of it can be debated either way, to see any Congress elected in 2024 come into office in 2025 and be willing to vote for anything that a large swath of politicians and interest groups will depict as a massive increase in costs on American taxpayers. And so we can look at opportunities potentially maybe to pass a border adjustment. How that works without a domestic carbon price still needs to be explained or thought of. But I think we're in a difficult world in that respect, where what we have is the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS Science Act, and all inspired, or much of them inspired, by the Energy Act. And that's what we need to think about in terms of how we operate moving forward.
Great. Thanks so much, guys. I think maybe the first thing I wanted to talk about, as I think some of the stuff that Josh was talking about kind of really already leading to conflict, is the current UAW strike, and kind of how that kind of exemplifies the different tensions within the Biden administration's energy and policy. Because the way I see it is, on the one hand, Biden has made it very clear. I think he started his campaign with the IBEW. He really supports union workers. There's a lot of stuff in all these bills, especially for the building trades, to encourage, prevailing wages and so forth. He also supports electric vehicles and batteries being made in the United States. And if you ask a car company or any company where they want to build a factory, They want to build it in Georgia. They want to build it in Tennessee. They don't want the UAW involved, and they want a Korean or Chinese partner to do it. And as far as I can tell, these two ideas, build lots of electric vehicles and batteries in the United States, support union workers, especially in manufacturing, are strongly held in the White House and are completely unintegrated when it comes to this strike. So I was thinking, Josh, how would you integrate these two ideas?
I think if I had a immediate answer, I'd probably be in Detroit right now rather than here. Look, I think that it's part of the inherent conflict of why we're having this strike is how do you square the reality that we're seeing a lot more auto manufacturing being built in right-to-work states, Georgia, South Carolina, Kentucky, than we are in places like Michigan and Ohio right now. On that regard, it is more than a little ironic that you're seeing Republican elected officials who are pro-right to work also talking up the UAW's right to strike and supporting it and depicting it as purely about electric vehicles. I mean, I think part of the challenge here is the reality that electric vehicles are likely to be just overwhelmingly dominating the kinds of cars that consumers are buying by 2030, 2035 at the latest. And I think underlying what the Biden administration's decision has been is, for a whole bunch of reasons, including just national interest, economic security, they want them built in the United States. And so the tension is not, do we build them in the United States or not? I think the tension underlying it is, how do you build them in a way that keeps the constituencies that the Biden administration is trying to balance all aligned? And we're seeing that's I think even more difficult than they would have than they realized.
Yeah.
Just to jump in on that, I think the strike, I'm really glad you brought that up. I think that highlights that even subsidies are not politically costless. I mean, I think it really highlights that the Biden administration is taking some flack for putting their thumb on the scale so directly for electric vehicles, even though we have all these provisions built in with, our strong incentives for hiring union labor. I guess I want to push back on my fellow panelists too. I just think we need to get over this idea that the US is never going to have a carbon price. Like, take us to 2050. We're going to be at net zero, hopefully. Maybe it's 2060. So we're still going to be emitting some stuff in the atmosphere. We're going to be paying to take it out of the atmosphere with things like direct air capture. It's just dumb to let it go into the atmosphere for free. It makes no sense.
Well, that's fine, but politicians' first job is to get reelected, and they know that if they vote for a carbon price that puts a tax on the public, they're gone.
It makes people's toasters like 5 cents more expensive. There are ways to define there are ways to circumscribe a carbon tax so that it doesn't apply to retail gasoline. It doesn't apply to residential electricity. There's a way to make it like very innocuous, I think the union example shows us that you can get leadership. You can, 10% of the country is in a union, but the president has made union a big deal. I think, leadership can make doing the right thing politically viable.
I think an interesting thing, and then Rob brought this up about how, undercurrent of all this, how politically durable all this stuff will be. And like, when you're thinking about implementation, actually having the law in effect really, really matters. So I want everyone, if you want to kind of do a little role-playing exercise. It's 2025. Maybe there's a Democratic House, but there's a Republican Senate and a Republican president. They want to do an energy policy. They want to say, at the end of the day, they've repealed the IRA. They want you to take one big part out of it to say that they've gotten rid of Biden's ruinous subsidies, with the understanding that they keep some of it. What big part are you taking out of it to satisfy this desire to repeal the IRA?
Yes, are we going down the line?
Go, sure.
I would take the electric vehicle subsidies out. The electric vehicle subsidies, we've done some work. CBO, JCT estimate way, way, way lowballed the electric vehicle subsidies. I think there's a lot of agreement amongst subsequent modeling that the electric vehicle subsidies are going to be hundreds of billions of dollars. And there's also, a lot of projections, Josh referred to this, that electric vehicles are just going to become kind of important in their own right. If it were up to me, I would put some of that money into charging stations. So I just did a bit of that, but I think the more we put into charging stations, that'll have these kind of complementary spillover effects and encourage electric vehicle purchases with a lot less of a fiscal cost.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think you'd see, I think if that political scenario or some version of that happens, the push to, at the very least, significantly change how EV subsidies are implemented, let alone maybe getting rid of them ideally, I totally agree, putting some of that funding towards accelerating infrastructure for charging would be the first thing that you'd see discussed.
I don't know enough about it to have a particular opinion.
All right. I wanted to, I was reading my favorite section of any newspaper, the Wall Street Journal opinion page, and that's a joke. And I read a column by Josh's favorite senator, Joe Manchin of West Virginia. I gotta say, as a reporter who writes about energy and economic policy, calling up someone who works at a Democratic-aligned think tank to say something nice about Joe Manchin, very difficult. Josh is very brave in that he'll do it sometimes. I believe he said that he's now defending the Inflation Reduction Act. He now thinks it's a good idea, which he did when it passed. There's a long period he thought it was a bad idea. It's a good idea again. Don't ask me why. He says it's not a red bill. It's not a blue bill. It's not a green bill. It's an American bill. And he then lists a series of carbon power plant projects that have been funded, has some aspect being funded through the IRA. I guess this is to anyone here. Is he correct that that is happening? And two, is that the bill working or not working as kind of a piece of energy policy for the energy mix that we have right now?
I mean, he wrote the bill. So I think that I think he's the first person whose word you should take in terms of both intent and outcome. But I think that your point also about Senator Manchin authoring the bill, therefore one would assume being a champion of it, then deciding at least various parts and implementation weren't going the way he wanted to, and now being a champion of parts of it again, is also just a reminder. Again, the people who are writing our laws are fundamentally politicians. He may very well, very hopefully, because he's the best Democrat we'll get, will be running for re-election in West Virginia next year. And so Manchin is the only Democrat who can win in that state. He's got a sense of how he needs to calibrate and how he wants to see his constituents reading about it. I think, it's not cynical, it's just reality. That's why he's talking about it the way he is.
My next question was for Rob. To prepare for this panel, I was reviewing some of your work, and a lot of it is about, you kind of divide up the ways of thinking about industrial policy. The good way, the ITIF way, is the Hamiltonian way. That is, kind of supporting national champions to do economic and technological development. The bad way is the green equity way, which is mixing together a combination of wanting to reduce carbon emissions with kind of wanting to restructure the economy on kind of a antitrust competition lens, make businesses smaller, and kind of have the benefits of those subsidies and businesses flow to populations that are not just white men. You have a lot of quotes from various think tankers and policy advocates laying out the green equity vision. I guess my question to you, if you look at these four bills that Josh described, is which force is winning out right now in either the kind of construction of these bills or in the implementation of them, of those two approaches? Because when I read about it, it seemed like you had written a very convincing and compelling critique of Roosevelt Institute staffers' tweets, and how that played into the legislation wasn't always as clear. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about that.
Yeah, well, a couple things. First of all, we're not advocating picking national champions. We're advocating focusing on key sectors, key industries, and key technologies, which is a little different. The fundamental difference between where there's kind of three main camps, neoliberalism, if you want to call it neoclassical economics, which is more, at best, they're going to say, let's fund more research and make sure that everybody finishes college and a few things like that. Vastly insufficient. And then what you have, though, is this progressive wing that decided that industrial policy was sort of where they were going to go. But what you have to understand about their industrial policy is, at the end of the day, they don't really like industry. They literally talk about having a green daycare industry policy. So we need a daycare industry policy. We might need daycare policy. It's not my area, but nobody's talking about restructuring the daycare industry for that. So the problem is, if you look at what Lena Khan is doing in the FTC, Lena Khan's basic whole premise and the whole movement, Roosevelt Institute and Barry Lynn and all these people, they say it's to focus on increases in concentration. There have been no increases in concentration in the US economy since 2002. In fact, the most concentrated industries have gotten less concentrated. You would never know that from listening to these people. What do they want? They want an economy that basically has a dramatically reduced role for small companies. The one exception to that is going to be in climate. But even there, why don't they like nuclear? Because nuclear is fundamentally a centralized technology. You need an enormous amount of capital. I'm not going to have a nuclear plant in my backyard. I might have a solar panel in my backyard or my roof or whatever like that. And then the second big difference is they're ultimately Keynesian in nature. They think that the problem of the US economy is not enough jobs and not enough good jobs. The problem in the US economy is certainly not about jobs. At the lowest unemployment rate we've had the US economy has no problem creating jobs unless we're in a recession. So that isn't the issue. The issue then, they say, is, well, we need good jobs. No, the issue is we need higher productivity growth. We've had the lowest rate of productivity growth in really probably since 1789. We've only measured it from 47, but the lowest rate of productivity growth over the last 10 years. US manufacturing in the last 10 years has seen negative productivity growth. I don't know if you read Greg Ip's piece of the Wall Street Journal, but we've seen US manufacturing have lower productivity today than they had 10 years ago. This has never happened in American history. Where is the left on that? Where's the Biden administration on that? Josh, I kind of have to disagree with you when you say they're doing this to get good jobs in the heartland. The Biden administration proposed when they were running the campaign, they were going to triple the NIST Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program. It's going up maybe 20-25%. They proposed they were going to significantly expand the Manufacturing USA Institutes, which was a program that we helped get off the ground. One new center in all of that legislation, one new center. So we don't have a manufacturing policy. And the Roosevelt Institute does not want one. This is about transforming the US economy to a different kind of way. And my last point is, there's always the idea that somehow you can create good jobs. One of the things that they say about the green energy transition is going to be great because it's going to create more jobs. Well, if you think about that for a minute, by definition, that means you're going to have lower wage jobs. You have the same amount of energy produced with more workers. By definition, that means they will make less money because you're going to take an oil worker who's making $140,000. So you can't sort of argue this, well, we're going to create all sorts of jobs and we're going to create good jobs. Good jobs come from high productivity.
Yeah, first, I think we should differentiate between the Roosevelt Institute and, frankly, any other think tank, including ours, and the Biden administration. And I think you'd have plenty of people, both within Roosevelt and within the administration, very surprised to think that it's our friends in New York who are driving the administration's policies. And so if you look, I think we can spend a lot of time, and I'm happy to do so, discussing both the inspiration and implementation of, or design of these bills. But there's an enormous difference between, the green agenda that you're characterizing and a series of bills, in the case of the Inflation Reduction Act, authored by Joe Manchin, who would be even more shocked that it was inspired by the Roosevelt Institute, as well as the design of them, which is oriented towards competition with China, bringing more manufacturing back to the U.S., which the CHIP Science Act has definitely done, to your point earlier, in the semiconductor industry, and looking at what are the sectors that we're going to get to scale up, and how. And part of the reason we were having the UAW strike is exactly the point about there are going to be a lot of efficiencies in addition to challenges with just the dramatically different requirements for manufacturing and component parts in electric vehicles than we have in plants that are 20, 30, 50 years old or older that have been producing internal combustion engine vehicles. And so these are all parts of the thinking that have gone into the policies that this administration has implemented, which, Jake Sullivan's speech at Brookings Institute in April, I think, is a really important capturing of what the animating thoughts are for the administration. And it really was focused on, we are in a global competition. We are facing significant challenges from countries like China and the Chinese government. And we need to think differently about defining what is in our national interest, both in terms of security and in terms of economics, and acting in that way to crowd in private capital. And, in fact, one of the things that we've heard is as a critique of the Biden administration in these policies is ultimately what they are trying to do is pull in more private industry to work with them, whether it is the big three in the auto industry, as well as foreign auto manufacturers manufacturing in the United States, or companies like Dow that is partnering with X Energy to build what we hope is the first nuclear-powered chemical facility in Texas, Nucor Steel, and on, where it is a fundamentally private sector-driven effort to provide more domestic clean manufacturing, more domestic clean power, and scaling that up, that is helped guided along by strategic government investments because it's been decided for a variety of reasons that it's in the national interest.
I completely agree that talking about aggregate job creation in a full employment economy doesn't make sense. I think what the policies are doing are acknowledging that the clean energy transition is going to displace some workers and trying to concentrate the new investments in the same communities. And so it's not about kind of aggregate job creation. It's about basically, job reshuffling. I guess one additional point, I get frustrated, admittedly, with some people in the administration, and I think your characterization of the neoliberal kind of camp. Economics is not a dogma. Economics is a very positive, it's a description of the way the world works or the way the economy works. And so I think if we forget that, we're going to be challenged. That is how demand curves slope down, incentives matter. I think we need to continue to recognize those principles.
When economists say, and they do say, that innovation is manna from heaven, it's a dogma. So we could have a long
Economists
argument
don't say that.
Most of what economics is in the U.S. is dogma. But Josh, to your point,
disagree.
when you say that all right. When you say that Jake Sullivan said, he's using this narrative about the strategic competition with China to justify this. Look, you can have an argument about whether IRA is important or that's fine. It is not what we don't need to do this with regard to China. Can imagine we're in a war with China and they cut off our solar panel imports. Like, holy crap, do we care? Do we honestly care? Because by the time it takes effect, the war is long over. What we care about are shipbuilding, aerospace, biotechnology, machine tools, semiconductors, All of those things where other than semiconductors, where we don't have a policy. So to somehow just say, well, it's an industrial policy and it's for China, it's a good talking point, but it is not true. This is not about China. This won't have any effect on our ability to have more power than China.
Sorry, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, you actually anticipated what my question would be, Catherine. I think as Rob has said, and I think kind of the stereotype people would have is that one reason industrial policy kind of faded in the 1990s especially is that a group of kind of even Keynesian, but new Keynesian or neoclassical economists took over. They were very skeptical of it. It stopped. It's now come back. I would want your perspective as an economist, how, and working with economists in Treasury and in the White House, are they comfortable with this approach to climate policy? Do they feel like they're being dragged into it by their political masters? Jake Sullivan, not an economist, he has a law degree. How is the economics profession kind of constructively contributing to this evolution in policy?
Yeah, I think economists understand constraints, understand political constraints, understand that Joe Manchin was the marginal voter in this case, and we needed to do what Joe Manchin wanted to do. And you could poll the economists, probably 99% would agree that climate change involves multiple market failures, and one of them is that there's an externality that's on price, but one of them is that there are huge positive externalities from research and development. And so I think all the money that we've been talking about that's going towards new technologies and that is really helping address that positive externalities is very important. So yeah, I think it's what economists would call second best, but to paraphrase Joe Biden, you don't want to compare it to the almighty, you want to compare it to the alternative. And relative to doing nothing, this is a huge, huge win.
Yeah, I remember when I read your Brookings paper, you said one of the tough things to model, but important thing to model in the bill is how much better we'll get at these various energy technologies just by doing more of them. And I guess, which sector that's getting all of this new investment do you think has the greatest potential for these kind of learning by doing, learning curve type developments that Rob said was so important in that, what's on that good line?
See, I think I shouldn't be answering this. I agree completely with Rob that part of the genius of IRA is that it's kind of technology neutral, that the production tax credit, investment tax credit explicitly starting in 2025 say it applies to any clean technology. And you can choose whether you want the production tax credit or the investment tax credit. So, we're letting the market evolve, we're letting the economy evolve and seeing what shakes out.
Well, all right. I want some more favoritism from the panel. What's everyone's favorite learning by doing technology?
To completely dodge that question, I think that Catherine's point is really important. First, it goes back to, again, 2020 with a bill that was truly bipartisan, that was really crafted by Senator Murkowski in the Senate, passed by the Republican Senate, the Democratic House, signed by President Trump, that said, we need to truly invest across the board in a significant variety of technologies and see how they come through the entire RD&D life cycle and then get to scale and compete against incumbent industries to see which ones emerge. I think there's a lot of interesting things going on with clean steel that are very exciting to see and could reap benefits for the United States globally. We're at Breakthrough Institute's conference, and we also work on this. So there's a ton of exciting work happening on advanced nuclear that we could also see both in terms of bringing to scale, learning by doing, bringing down cost. But those just really scratch the surface because you have so many different technologies that can take advantage of the suite of policies that have been implemented.
See, I don't think we should be technology neutral. The point of good technology policy is to actually use some analysis. And if you go back to that curve I showed, why would we be funding stuff that cannot get to below cost, to price performance parity? So what I find striking is that nobody's done that analysis that I'm aware of. That would have been an interesting analysis to do. We should still be doing that analysis. And you can't predict it with 100% certainty. I'm not saying that, but we should at least have some senses of that. My senses of it would be it's not going to be batteries, cars, solar, or wind. It's going to be more industrial, things that we're not, it'll be nuclear, things that we haven't done as much of yet, where building something can get you down that cost curve. But you'd think we would do that analysis.
But you don't think this will be discovered in the process? Because
Well, sure, but why waste all this money
No, there's a lot of analysis that's been going on. I mean,
on cost curves?
Yeah, on cost curves. Yeah, I mean,
On which ones are likely to go to below oil or dirty fuel costs?
so I think we need a carbon price. We need to price the emissions that are associated with that oil and coal. But I think with IRA, we're seeing carbon capture and sequestration. The models are projecting that it will be used by the end of the budget windows. They're projecting that clean hydrogen will be used. There's uncertainty there about how the implementation will go. There's kind of a small amount of direct air capture, but I wouldn't point to anything specifically in IRA and say that's just words on the page and it's not going to be metal in the ground.
I think, Matt, there's one other important point in all of this. And first, the suite of legislation that's passed certainly does a lot more than just incent the domestic production of solar panels. But also, to this point, there is a very important soft power component to international relations that the U.S. Has let lag for decades now, and we've seen China, to their credit, be very good with that. And the Belt and Road strategy and engagement with energy in Africa and in other parts of Asia, and on and on. And part of what the United States is now able to do is it a 5-year policy, is it a 10-year policy, is it is beyond that? We'll find out. But we too often don't do long-term investments. We will be able to start competing again and providing these resources to countries that we want to partner with, where we haven't had that opportunity in the same way in the past several decades.
All right. I think, Alex, right? Is it time for questions? Great. I think there should be some mics floating around, and if anyone wants to ask a question.
Yeah, the way we like to do this is take 2 or 3 questions and then let the panelists pick and choose which one to respond to. And I'm going to go over to Shelley here first.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm Shelley Fiddler. Hello. So I have a question for the panel and for the audience. Buy America. Nobody mentioned Buy America. I would like a show of hands for the people who think that the waivers that people have applied for under the IRA top 50 applications. Show of hands, anybody? Waivers of Buy America, top 400 applications. The numbers are gigantic. 900 waivers have been awarded. It's because of previous offshoring of economic stuff. Could you talk just a minute about that? It would be really helpful if the administration would start to grant some comprehensive waivers so people can get their work done in the United States. Anything?
We're
Thanks.
going to get in a few more questions.
Yeah.
Hi, Isaru Sen. Thanks for the discussion. I wanted to ask a question on kind of, if you think about China's policy going from mines to microchips, it was an investment across the whole value chain. Maybe any one of these individual pieces might not have made sense, but that's how they dominated the microchip space. Today we are realizing that there's no uranium enrichment capacity in the US and we need federal investment. So how do you think about this model of American innovation that's industry driven but if any of these individual industries don't make sense, but you need it for the whole.
We'll take Devin, and then we'll let the panel respond.
So one thing I thought would come up, frankly, earlier in the conversation, and the bar chart did get a little bit to it, was when you look at like the classification of IRA, which has many provisions, the majority of the expenditures are subsidies for mature technologies. So the majority of it doesn't go to the segments of industry classification where you get knowledge spillovers. I mean, would love to have a discussion on the role of federal government, basic and applied R&D, and infant industry argument debate, right? But the majority of this is actually going to mature technologies. So most of the calculus on this, when we look at it from an economic classification, is it's mostly a rent transfer from taxpayers to technologies that the private sector has been trying to build, but actually can't get through the regulatory approval process, and frankly doesn't have a good prospect in the next decade. So that point hasn't come up yet. So I'd love to hear a little bit more dissection of what's actually the innovation policy component of this. What's the mature technology, really inefficient, frankly, economic policy component of this? And then also looking at this from the reform conversation, going forward, like the price tag for IRA is not going to be a few $100 billion. We're looking at this probably being multiple trillions, or at least north of $1 trillion, depending on the type of assumptions you make on the sunset provisions that would kick in with the emissions target. So, which we're nowhere close to hitting. So I'd love to see maybe a little bit more discussion on dissecting those. Thanks.
All right, so we have Buy America, industrial policy across the value chain, and the R&D question. So whoever wants to go first. Good.
I'll take the first. I think we just need to be expansive about what we mean by R&D. I think the world has a lot to learn about what it looks like to run an electricity sector that's got, north of 70 or 80% renewables. So yes, solar and wind are mature technologies, but I think there's still a lot of learning that can happen. I think the second thing is that kind of by their very nature, if they're nascent technologies, we do the budget estimates over a 10-year window, and it's just going to take a while to get to the point where those technologies are being subsidized or being paid for, because they're still nascent, they're still working their way into commercialization, so they don't show up. On the domestic content provisions, I as an economist, am not that nuts about them. I think they so blatantly flout the World Trade Organization strictures that I think it leaves us, in peril. And I think as something like the carbon border adjustment mechanism shows, we can use the trade system. The trade system is in fact very important for reinforcing commitments to climate mitigation.
Yeah, so on your question about the Chinese very successful and smart strategy of mines to microchips, and is there a U.S. thinking behind it? We partnered with the Boston Consulting Group and Breakthrough Energy to examine 10 of what we combined believe are the emerging predominant sectors in the clean energy economy over the next 10 to 30 years, and looked at where in each of them the U.S. can be competitive and has advantages in the value chains and should be investing strategically along similar lines to what we saw with China. That report's on our website. We are working closely with a number of stakeholders in the Biden administration and elsewhere to have that help inform policy. I think on the Buy America provisions, yes, it's Senator Schumer is very enthusiastic about that. It is a very politically driven policy that when we see it actually being enacted, runs into a whole different set of challenges. I think hopefully the Biden administration will be able to do more to smooth that out. I do think, and when we've met with European elected officials and British elected officials, they always raise that and say, but you're going to be taken to the WTO and it's going to be a big problem, and isn't the Biden administration worried about that? I think the problem is that that's actually a feature, not a bug. To be able to go to the public and say, hey, we're being taken to court because we're defending American workers and American jobs. Not good policy, but boy, is that catnip for people who have to go to voters.
So A couple things. First of all, on China, pretty much you cannot find a successful Chinese export industry that was not built upon completely mercantilist, unfair practices. They just don't exist, and semiconductors is one. Secondly, I wouldn't call their semiconductor policy all that successful. It's been somewhat successful, but the amount of money they've wasted, I mean, they just put a whole bunch of these people in jail because they were wasting so much money. They will continue to spend as much money as it takes, and they will continue to advance, but it comes at an enormous cost for their treasury. With regard to Buy America, I don't have a problem with Buy America because, look at the European Union. I mean, they are incredibly protectionist. They have the amount of Buy European provisions in government procurement in Europe are 11 times greater than ours. So the Europeans are sanctimonious. They're like, oh, we don't do this. No, you do it 11 times more than we do it. The problem with Buy America, to this lady's point, is we've hollowed out our industry so dramatically that the Biden administration is so desperate to get it back. It wants to do this thing like right now. The problem is that for a lot of these things, and you see this now in broadband, where they're trying to build out broadband networks, but they just simply don't have the domestic production capability for certain kinds of electronic things and all that stuff. So they're having to do waivers. Obama, I think, did it better. They had more blanket waivers. So it's just a conflict that the administration, I don't think, really wants to confront the right way. Never should have allowed the weakness of U.S. manufacturing. We have this report called the Hamilton Index on Advanced Industry Production, and we're doing it. You look at our auto sector. The Germans' auto sector is about 2 times greater than the global average in terms of how much autos they have. The Japanese are about 2 times. The Chinese are about 1.9. We're about 0.6. So we have a diminished auto sector. We have a diminished machine tool sector. We have a diminished electronics sector. And there's no way you can sort of recreate that overnight. And so the Buy America things are, if they're strictly enforced, they are going to definitely get in the way of slowing down and raising the cost of these projects. And then the third point was your point about, look, I think, the Biden administration came, and I'm not saying this at all as a partisan. I was actually on a election team for Biden for advanced technologies. But the Biden administration had a big statement about a year and a half ago where they said, we have all the technology we need to solve climate at no increase in price. So I was, call me dubious. So I actually went and we sampled 2 of the studies. There were 9 studies. We just randomly picked 2 of them. And they both said the exact same thing. We have all the technologies we need today to solve climate, assuming 2 things. We continue to subsidize it, and we assume the price will fall by half. Okay. I'd call that a little bit of dubious salesmanship. But in the Biden administration mind, and it's not just them, it's the enviro mind overall, they honestly believe that forget this stuff about innovation. We don't have any time to wait. We got to do it now. And so funding an enormous amount of money on all these mature technologies where you're probably not going to get very much other than just lower prices. And even there, you're probably not going to get lower prices because of higher production costs in the US. You just move production here. That to them is the goal. That's what we want to be doing rather than longer term driving down to, with innovation, to price performance parity.
All right, Alex, I think that's it, or one more question, or?
Yeah, I think we have time for maybe a few more quick questions and quick responses.
I'm not even sure how to phrase my question, but this is Sarah Hunt. My team and I are in that space between words on paper and implementation and steel in the ground every single day. A lot in the States, some on the Hill. Like right now, my C4 lobbyist phone is ringing off the hook from Republican offices asking him which provisions of IRA they need to protect because it's jobs in their district. I'm not kidding. Other than that, the vast canyon between this conversation here today and what I see even from political reality day to day on the ground is sort of startling to me. And I have no idea how to think about that or what that means. If there's something that potentially is missing here in my brain or the conversation that any of you would like to bring up to help me feel better about it, because I'm feeling really nervous when I think I'm my team is in the States all the time, literally billions and billions of dollars of projects supported in part by IRA policies and dollars that our team is helping support in the States right now. And I'm not feeling a connect between this policy conversation in Washington and the reality of what's happening on the ground, and that kind of confuses me. Maybe I'm missing something.
I think the panel can take that question.
All right. Anyone want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, Sarah, I agree on your point about there's multiple different conversations happening right now, right? And we're hearing, and I'm really curious what the conversations on the ground you're hearing are, and sort of the interactions. We are hearing a lot of concerns, for example, from companies working with localities and with the state around. I mean, there's just a lack of capacity. Like, states and localities do not have the people to manage the projects, the approvals, all of the different things to put steel in the ground and actually build things. We're having a massive challenge around workforce. I mean, one of the upsides of extremely low unemployment is it's hard to find workers to hire to build these projects. So I think you could go on, and there's a whole separate, equally or perhaps more important in terms of the success of these bills, conversation around what does it look like with rubber meeting the road, and where are the challenges? Permitting is another issue, and both in terms of the regulatory, but then also what are the non-regulatory obstacles that are going to prevent projects from being built over the next year, 5 years, 10 years. One of the conversations Alex mentioned is the conversation update on the NRC, but you multiply that across everything. Transmission is the same thing. So I think there could be many more panels around that. I do think, to your other point about investment going to red districts and red states, I frankly have been surprised how many reporters have called me and said, well, isn't that a flaw of the laws? Is the Biden administration giving money to Republican districts? Isn't that horrible? It's like, no. I mean, that's actually great. And so the fact that they're saying, what do we need to protect, is, I think, a feature of the legislation.
Yeah, I guess I would just emphasize there are a lot of different levels that conversations about IRA are happening on, and I think it's important to think about the international ramifications of IRA and how this will either help or hinder some kind of global cooperation around climate.
All right, I think that's it, guys. Thanks. I want to thank our panelists for this great discussion, and yeah, it was really great, guys. Thank you.